is great to see you all here this morning. Welcome with us. Rick, thank you for leading us in worship and guiding our minds. I appreciate that. I do want to welcome those who are online. We're grateful that you are here, and we hope that all of our guests are able to stick around and let us get to know you a little bit, or if you're online, leave us a comment and let us get to know you that way as well. We all have high points in our lives, right? We all have those moments in our life where we look back and we say, that was a good moment in time. I have many of those, but one of the ones that I want to highlight this morning takes place in the panhandle of Oklahoma. I know, bear with me. Apparently, you guys are unfamiliar with the amazingness of Black Mesa. Still no wows. Guys, this is the largest or the highest point in Oklahoma at 5,000 feet. Okay, it's not a 14er. It's by no means a gorgeous location, but it grows on you, especially after some heat stroke. I mean, it starts to look pretty nice. This is where I went to church camp growing up, was at Black Mesa Bible Camp. Established in 1965, when my mother was going to camp there, they had a lake. Since then, they moved the camp to another location, and the only body of water we had was a cow trough, which we used for our water games so that we would not have heat stroke too often, and for our baptisms and things like that. It was a wonderful place to go. I mean, every day you would break down and set up the mess hall, either to sitting arrangements like we have today, or for food. So you had to kind of work for your food. I got really good at setting up tables and chairs. And to top it all off, every day you had to wash your own dishes. Doesn't it sound wonderful? I mean, it's just an all-expense paid vacation. I mean, it's just wonderful. This is a place where I grew in my faith. Oh, and I forgot to mention, every day we had a test, like an actual test that we had to take over our Bible lessons that had taken place earlier that morning. When we think about some place like the desert of Oklahoma, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? It's a bit of a paradox. On one hand, the desert is a place of danger, of trials, of difficulties, of scarceness. And yet the desert, as we look in the pages of Scripture, is also a place of refuge. It's a place where the people of Israel went to meet with God. It was a place where David found refuge and safety on the run. It was a place where Moses found himself, where he found his God. The desert is a bit of a paradox. It's both a place of testing and trial, but it's also a place of great refuge. Jesus begins his ministry in the desert. He goes out to the Jordan to be baptized by John, and then he heads out into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days. If we look in Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 2, and when the tempter came, he said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Jesus finds himself in the desert for 40 days. He hasn't eaten anything, and at the end of that, he is hungry. One of the greatest overstatements of all of Scripture. 40 days of fasting, and Jesus was hungry. He was hungry, guys. Like 40 days. I don't know how I'm going to go the next 40 minutes without food, but I'll figure it out. But 40 days. Jesus found himself, and Satan comes to him and says, "Well, turn these stones into bread." And Jesus says, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." And in doing so, Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 8. He's quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 8. In many ways, Jesus is alluding here to the fact that he is following the path of Israel while they were in the desert, to some extent in reverse, going from the Jordan into the desert and then spending 40 days, where Israel spent 40 years and then came to the Jordan. Jesus succeeds where Israel fails. He learns the lesson that Israel failed to learn. If we look over at Deuteronomy chapter 8, where Jesus is quoting from, starting in verse 1, we read, "The whole commandment Moses says, that I commanded you today shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that He might humble you, testing you, that you may know what is in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. And He humbled you. He let you hunger, and He fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell during these 40 years. Satan comes to tempt Jesus as He finds Himself in the desert, as He finds Himself hungry. And Satan says, well, why don't you turn this stone into manna? Why don't you feed yourself? And Jesus says, I have learned the lesson that Israel failed to learn, that God will provide, that God is with me. See, the desert is a place where we grow closer to God. We find refuge and strength. Jesus succeeded where Israel failed. We find ourselves often in the desert, don't we? Not just because of the droughts that we find ourselves in, but the deserts of life, the difficult moments of life where the challenges and the struggles of life really tempt us and try us. And they can either be a place of scarcity and difficulty, or they can be a place where we come nearer to God. In James chapter 1, what does he say? He says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of various kinds. Why? Because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you might be complete and mature, lacking nothing. The desert is a place where we learn. Trials of life is a place where we come nearer to our God. So this morning, we're going to begin a new series. We're going to be looking at the Exodus. We're going to be seeking to learn the lessons that Israel was supposed to be learning. But we're not going to be studying the book of Exodus so that we can know the book of Exodus. Instead, we want to use the book of Exodus as a jumping off point for us to learn the lessons, so that as we go through the deserts in our lives, we are able, like Jesus, to endure the trials and the temptations, so that we can learn to trust and follow our God. Let's begin by looking over at Exodus chapter 2. We're going to begin at the end of Exodus chapter 2. And while you're turning there, I want to encourage you to begin to read through the book of Exodus. Begin to study the book of Exodus, because we're going to take large swaths of the book of Exodus. For instance, surprisingly, I'm going to cover everything from Exodus 1 all the way to Exodus 5 today. I mean, that's a large section, so go home and read and study, right? Let's begin here in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help, and their cries for rescue from the slavery came up to God. And God heard their groanings. God remembered His covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw His people, Israel, and He knew. You would think that this is where the book of Exodus would begin, right? I mean, we've all seen The Prince of Egypt, the DreamWorks production. The movie begins with the people crying, "Deliver us!" Right? "Rescue us! God, where are you?" You would assume that it would begin where the book of Genesis ends, with the people of Israel going into Egypt, welcomed warmly, and some sort of a quick briefer of the last 100 years stating the fact that, Israel fell into slavery and the king was mean to them and they called out to deliver us. And then God sent a deliverer. But we're at the end of chapter 2. What's taken place in the last chapter and a half? Well, Moses has happened. Moses was saved by his mother, put into the reeds, found, brought into the king's household, trained and raised up as a prince of Egypt. lived for 40 years in such a state until he rose up and struck down an Egyptian who was beating a fellow Israelite. And then he fled into the desert and has spent the last 40 years tending sheep. And it's here that we're told that the people of Israel are crying out to God, some 80 years into Moses' life, at the end of chapter 2. So has God forgotten His people? Not at all. There's a word here in the passage we just read, the word know, and God knew. It's an interesting word. It appears 8 times in the first 5 chapters of the book of Exodus, 4 times in the first 2 chapters. It begins in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, and the new king did not know. The new king did not know. Then in Exodus chapter 2, Moses' sister stood on the bank of the Nile seeking to know. Seeking to know. She wanted to know. Then Moses flees Egypt because he's afraid. The king knows. And now we come to the end of Exodus chapter 2 in verse 25, and God saw, and God knows. God knows. See, God has been listening the whole time. Moses, as he writes the book of Exodus, is seeking to make a point. The point is not that the people of Israel have not been calling out to God for the last couple hundred years. It's not that they have been okay with slavery and finally woke up some 80 years into Moses' life and cried out to God, and God now remembers. God has worked through Moses' mother to save his life. God has worked in Moses' life to put him in the palace. God has worked in Moses' life to train him in all the wisdom of Egypt. God has worked to raise up Moses to think that he should be the deliverer of the people. And he seeks to do that by his own power, by his own might, and has to flee and spends the next 40 years learning to tend sheep. God has been working in the lives of the Israelites for years. God knows. God is aware of what is going on. That's what's going on. God knows. But this leads us to another important point for us to learn from our text this morning: the importance of prayer. The importance of prayer. God not only knows what's going on, but He wants us to tell Him what's going on. He wants us to call out. He wants us to come to Him. And the fact that God knows also necessitates that we be honest with Him. We're not going to shield Him from some of the information. We don't need to break the news to Him kindly and gently. We can come to Him and we can bring to Him our heart's desire. We can bring to Him the situation as we see it. And we can know and we can pray to Him in confidence, knowing that He is already at work, that He already has a plan, that He knows what's going on, He sees what's going on, and He has a plan. We see the importance of prayer here, but we also see the power of prayer, the fact that our God already knows and desires for us to bring these requests before Him. Now this then brings us to chapters 3 and 4. Moses is called by God, a man who is in his 80s or his late 70s, and is called by God. In Exodus chapter 3, 7 and the first part of verse 8, the Lord said to Moses, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cries because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and with honey. God makes very clear that He knows what's going on. God is aware of what's going on, and He is calling Moses to participate in what God is going to do. But life experience in Moses' life has taught him that he is not equal to the task at hand. He is not equipped for leading of this great multitude. He is not equal to the task of taking on the king of Egypt. But what Moses fails to understand, and what we must understand, is that our God is more than equal to the task. God is more than equal, more than able to take on the difficult task of bringing His people up out of Egypt. And with God, all things are possible. So Moses, while he is concerned about the task at hand, while he does not feel confident at the task at hand, and while he rightly sees that he is not able to do the task at hand, what he fails to understand, and what we must understand, is with God, we can. And we can go with confidence because God knows what's going on. God knows the challenges better than we do. And He's not concerned because He knows how He's going to do it. He knows how He's going to work through us. If we jump down to verse 18 through 20, we read, And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord your God, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now, please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do with it. After that, He will let you go. God knows. Right? God knows what's going on. God knows that Moses can go to the elders of Israel, and the elders will listen. The elders will accept that God has come, that salvation, their prayers are finally answered. And they will go with Moses to the king. God knows that that will happen, but God also knows that Pharaoh will not let the people of Israel go. God knows the challenge that lies ahead in the king. But God also knows that if He stretches out His mighty right hand, that God will be able to bring them up victoriously, that they will be able to plunder Egypt as they leave. See, the future is not a mystery to our God. God is aware of the challenges. God is aware of the struggles ahead. We can trust Him. And God even reveals slowly some of the mystery that lies ahead to Moses so that he knows that God is aware and capable, so that he is aware of what is coming. But Moses is still hesitant. He has excuses. He says, well, I'm not good in my speech, and I have difficulty with this, and I really just don't want to. And don't we struggle with that too? When we see the struggles ahead, don't we often say, I don't want to? Right? Sometimes we begin down a road and we're not fully aware of what it means, and we get into it and we say, well, I'm so far into it, I'm not going to back out now. I believe in what I'm doing, but had I known the difficulties and the challenges that I would have to have faced, maybe I would have made a different decision. Maybe I wouldn't have taken on that responsibility. Moses is hesitant. Sometimes we're hesitant. But God does something interesting here. And I'm reading a little bit between the lines and summarizing large sections of text here. But God basically asked Moses, well, what's in your hand? And he looks over and he says, well, it's a stick. And God says, well, put the stick down. And it becomes a snake. God says, pick it up again. And he picks it up and it becomes a stick again. And God basically says, you might not be able to do the task, Moses, but take the stick. The stick can obey my will. The stick can do what it needs to do. Take the stick and you will be fine. Sometimes we need to understand that all we need is obedience. We need to take the proverbial stick that God has given to us and take it to Egypt because it can do His will. Sometimes we just have to be faithful in carrying the stick. And we will part the Red Sea. We will turn the Nile to blood. We will turn the stick, well, we won't, but God will turn the stick into a snake. God is able to do these things. Moses doesn't believe he's capable, but God says, well, take the stick. If you're not capable, that's fine, but you can carry the stick. You be the stick carrier. The stick will lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. God knows what's going to happen. God is aware of what is happening. God reveals to Moses that his brother is on his way. Kind of a little pep talk, trust me, trust my words, trust that everything that I'm telling you is true. Your brother is on his way. He'll be your mouthpiece for you. But the last no that I want to highlight this morning is found in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. Pharaoh says, I do not know this God, and therefore I will not release the Israelites into the desert. We begin the story of Exodus with a new Pharaoh rising up that did not know. The people of Israel are seeking to know. And Moses is afraid of what the king knows, but the king doesn't know. And we're told in chapter 5 that the king doesn't know. But we're told very clearly that God knows. God demonstrates that He knows. God demonstrates that His knowledge is complete. And Pharaoh is destroyed for a lack of knowledge. The kingdom of Egypt will be laid waste because he does not know the Lord. He does not know that God knows all things, that He is capable of all things. So this morning, as we begin this journey of seeking to get to know God, as we seek to learn the lessons that the difficult desert of life have to teach us, as we seek to learn those lessons, I hope that we will walk away from today's lesson with a knowledge of who God is, that He is a God who knows. He's a God that we can go to in prayer, that we can lay our hearts bare because He knows what's happening and He has a plan and He is capable to deliver us. He is capable of bringing about the righteousness of God. Aren't we grateful for that we serve a God who is capable, who is able? He simply calls us to answer the call in our lives. So for us as Christians, this is a reminder for us to pick up our cross and to walk that difficult road, to learn the lessons that the difficulties of life have to teach us. This is a reminder to stay the course and to learn to walk with God. But maybe you don't know God. Maybe you've recently picked up the Bible and have begun to flip through its pages and seek to understand its message. Well, this is an opportunity for you to begin to learn who God is. This is an opportunity for you to begin that journey through the difficulties of life. Maybe you've already begun that journey somewhat and you understand what it means to follow God and you've been on the fence about when to take that step. I want to let you know that the water is ready. And if you are ready to put the Lord on in baptism, the water's ready. But if you still have questions, we want to answer those questions. We want to help you to open up the Word of God and to understand what it says. We want to help you in your walk of faith. So whether you need the encouragement of the congregation, or whether you need to begin a study, or whether you have a prayer request, whatever that is, we invite you to come and to walk with God as we stand and while we sing.